Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. Date: May 10, 1969. The jungle was thick with humidity, a dense wall of green that seemed to swallow sound and light whole. Specialist Jake Red Adams wiped the sweat from his brow as he listened to the choppers overhead, the rhythmic thumping of their blades echoing through the valley. They had been camped just a few clicks away from the base of Hill 937, a location that had earned the ominous nickname Hamburger Hill after weeks of intense combat. The battle was in its final stages, but the fighting had been fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. "Alright, listen up," Captain Mitchell barked as the men of Bravo Company gathered around. "Command's got intel that Charlie's dug in deep on Hill 937. Our job is to push them out no matter the cost." Jake glanced at his buddy, Corporal Tom Smitty Smith, who gave him a grim nod. They'd been through hell together over the past year, but something about this mission felt different, heavier, as if the very air around them was thicker with dread. "First light tomorrow, we move out," the captain continued. "Reckons reported some strange activity on the hill lights where there shouldn't be. Shadows moving in the night. We're to expect heavy resistance, but whatever's up there, we'll clear it out." As the meeting broke up, Jake lingered near the captain. "Sir, these reports, what exactly are we dealing with?" Captain Mitchell paused, his eyes narrowing. "Ghost stories, Red. Don't let them get in your head. Stay sharp and remember your training. We'll get through this." May 12, 1969. The ascent begins. The following morning, the platoon began their ascent up the hill, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant echoes of gunfire. The path was steep, the jungle closing in around them like a living, breathing entity. Every step was a struggle, the weight of their packs pulling them down. But the real burden was the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that gripped each soldier's heart. Jake kept his M16 at the ready, scanning the thick foliage for any signs of movement. The reports of strange activity weighed heavily on his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The jungle was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird, and even that seemed unnatural, forced, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Red," Smitty whispered, falling in step beside him. "You feel that?" Jake nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Yeah, like we're not alone." The platoon pressed on, the terrain becoming more treacherous as they climbed higher. Vines and roots seemed to reach out for their boots, tripping them up as they navigated the steep incline. The fog began to roll in, thick and cloying, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. It wasn't long before they lost sight of the men ahead of them, swallowed by the dense mist. "Hold up," Sergeant Davis called from the front of the line. The platoon halted, weapons at the ready, as Davis consulted his map. "We should be close to the first checkpoint. Keep your eyes peeled." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the fog-covered jungle. The stories of Hamburger Hill had spread like wildfire among the troops, stories of soldiers disappearing without a trace, of ghostly figures seen at the edge of the fog, of the screams of the dying echoing through the night. He dismissed them as just that, stories, but now, standing in the oppressive silence, he wasn't so sure. "Red," Smitty whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Look." Jake followed his gaze and froze. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the fog, was a figure soldier, standing deathly still. But something was off. The uniform was old, worn, and tattered, not like the ones they wore. And the eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring back at him. Before Jake could react, the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog as if it had never been there. "Smitty, did you see that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Smitty nodded, his face pale. Yeah, I did." The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Platoon, this is command. Be advised, We've lost contact with the forward unit. Proceed with extreme caution. The message sent a chill down Jake's spine. He exchanged a worried glance with Smitty, but there was no turning back now. They were committed, and whatever lay ahead, they would have to face it head on. As the platoon moved forward, the fog grew thicker, the jungle around them growing darker and more oppressive. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of boots on the forest floor. But even that sound seemed muted, as if the jungle was absorbing it, pulling it into the shadows. And then they heard it, the first scream, a blood-curdling cry that echoed through the mist, sending a wave of terror through the platoon. They froze, weapons at the ready, scanning the fog for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the lingering echo of the scream. "Keep moving," Sergeant Davis ordered, his voice betraying a hint of fear. "We've got a job to do?" Jake forced himself to take another step, his mind racing. What the hell was happening? He had faced enemy fire, endured ambushes and booby traps, but this was something different, something far worse. As they continued their ascent, the fog seemed to grow thicker, the shadows darker. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent his heart racing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The jungle came back into view, and they found themselves standing at the edge of a clearing. The ground was littered with debris, helmets, rifles, torn uniforms, but no bodies. Where the hell did they go? Smitty muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't have an answer. All he knew was that, whatever had happened here, it wasn't natural. And as they pushed forward, deeper into the heart of Hamburger Hill, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the jaws of something monstrous. The sun was high in the sky, but its rays barely penetrated the thick canopy above. The platoon trudged onward, the weight of their packs and gear dragging them down as the oppressive heat and humidity sapped their energy. The earlier sight of the ghostly figure still lingered in Jake's mind, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the mission at hand. They had a job to do, and there was no room for hesitation. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the fog that had momentarily lifted earlier returned, even thicker this time. It rolled in like a living thing, swirling around their legs and rising up to their chests, obscuring the path ahead. The once vibrant jungle now seemed muted, the greens and browns dulled by the heavy mist. It was as if the very life had been sucked out of the forest, leaving behind only a shadow of what it once was. "Stay close," Sergeant Davis ordered, his voice tense. "We don't want anyone getting separated." Jake kept his eyes on the man in front of him, Smitty's broad back a reassuring presence. But the further they went, the more disoriented he became. The fog seemed to play tricks on his mind, making the trees around them twist and warp in unnatural ways. The jungle had always been an unpredictable place, but this felt wrong, like they were walking through a nightmare. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But even those sounds seemed off, distorted by the fog. And then there were the whispers, faint, barely audible, but they're all the same. Jake couldn't tell if they were real or just his imagination, but they set his nerves on edge. "Did you hear that?" Smitty asked, glancing back at him. Jake nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. "Yeah, what the hell is it?" "I don't know, man, but I don't like it." The whispers grew louder as they continued, more distinct. They seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees. Jake strained to make out the words, but they were in a language he didn't understand, foreign, ancient, filled with malice. His skin crawled as the whispers seemed to wrap around him, pulling him deeper into the fog. "Eyes up, men," Sergeant Davis called out, his voice cutting through the eerie silence. "We're almost there," but where there was, no one could say. The jungle had closed in around them, the path ahead obscured by the thick mist. It was as if the hill itself was trying to swallow them whole, pulling them into its depths. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. The platoon came to a halt, the silence so complete it was deafening. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the fog, every sense on high alert, and then, out of the mist, a figure appeared. It was a soldier, just like the one they had seen earlier, standing perfectly still in the middle of the path. But this time, there was no doubt it wasn't one of theirs. The uniform was wrong, tattered and stained with mud and blood, and the eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, staring straight at them. "Jesus Christ," Smitty muttered, taking a step back. "Hold your fire." Sergeant Davis barked, though his voice shook with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching them with those empty eyes. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the figure wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the fog, one by one, until they were surrounded on all sides. Dozens of ghostly soldiers, all staring at them with those same hollow eyes. "We need to move," Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, the platoon began to back away, their movements slow and cautious. But as they did, the ghostly figures began to move as well, closing in on them. Jake's heart raced as the air grew colder, the fog pressing in around them like a vice. "Go!" Davis shouted, breaking the spell. "Go now." The platoon broke into a run, their boots pounding against the earth as they fled through the jungle. The fog seemed apart for them, the ghostly figures fading back into the mist as they ran. But the whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic, as if the spirits were chasing them, urging them to stop, to turn back. Jake's lungs burned as he ran, his mind racing. What the hell was happening? What were those things? Ghosts, spirits, or something worse? The fear gnawed at him, threatening to consume him, but he pushed it down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Finally, they burst out of the fog and into a small clearing. The jungle seemed brighter here, the sun piercing through the canopy above, casting everything in a warm, golden light. But the sense of relief was short-lived. "Is everyone here?" Davis asked, his voice breathless. The men quickly counted off, and Jake's heart sank as he realized they were missing two. Private Harris and Corporal Jenkins were nowhere to be seen. "They were right behind us," Smitty said, panic creeping into his voice. "Where the hell did they go?" Davis scanned the tree line, his face grim. "We don't have time to go back. We need to keep moving, but we can't just leave them," Jake protested, his voice rising. "We don't have a choice," Davis replied, his tone harsh. "Whatever those things were, they took them. And if we don't keep moving, they'll take us too." Jake wanted to argue, but he knew Davis was right. The jungle was no place to linger, especially with those things out there. But as they moved on, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the spirits of Hill 937 were following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. May 12, 1969, evening. The jungle began to take on an ominous, oppressive feel as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The golden light that had bathed the small clearing they'd found earlier was quickly fading, replaced by the encroaching shadows of night. The men of the platoon, already shaken by the loss of Harris and Jenkins, grew quieter as they pressed on. Each of them was acutely aware of the jungle's eerie stillness, the way the once teeming forest had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath. Jake's thoughts were a jumble of fear and uncertainty. The jungle had always been an unforgiving place, but now it felt malevolent, as if the very land was turning against them. He couldn't stop thinking about the ghostly figures they had encountered. Were they really the spirits of dead soldiers, or was his mind playing tricks on him? Either way, the fear was real, gnawing at him like a persistent ache. As nightfall approached, Sergeant Davis ordered the platoon to make camp. They found a small, defensible position nestled among a cluster of boulders, surrounded by thick vegetation. The men set to work, unpacking their gear and setting up a perimeter, but there was no talk of a campfire. The darkness was coming too fast, and none of them wanted to draw attention to themselves, not in this haunted place. Keep your eyes open, Davis warned as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. We'll set up a watch rotation. No one sleeps more than 2 hours at a time. Jake's turn came early. He sat with his back against one of the larger boulders, his rifle resting across his lap, straining his ears for any sound, any sign of movement. But all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the steady rush of blood in his ears. The jungle around him was unnervingly silent, as if every creature had fled or was hiding from something unseen. As the minutes ticked by, the darkness deepened, becoming almost tangible. The moon was only a sliver in the sky, offering little light to penetrate the dense canopy above. Every shadow seemed to shift and move, taking on strange, menacing shapes. Jake's mind began to play tricks on him, conjuring images of those ghostly figures from earlier, lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling sound from the underbrush nearby. Jake froze, his fingers tightening around his rifle. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the source of the noise. It could be an animal, he told himself, or maybe one of the other men shifting in their sleep. But deep down, he knew it was something else. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it was directly in front of him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately. It was a soldier, but not one of theirs. The uniform was unmistakable North Vietnamese, but it was tattered and torn, stained with mud and blood. The figure's face was obscured by the darkness, but Jake could see enough to know that something was terribly wrong. The soldier's movements were unnatural, jerky, as if he were being controlled by unseen force. He staggered forward, his head lolling to one side, and Jake felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Jake. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke, "Go back or die here like the others." Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, echoing with an otherworldly quality that made his skin crawl. He wanted to raise his rifle, to fire at the apparition and make it disappear, but his body refused to move. He was paralyzed by fear, rooted to the spot as the ghostly soldier continued to approach. Before the figure could reach him, a hand clamped down on Jake's shoulder, snapping him out of his trance. He spun around, his heart racing, to find Smitty standing behind him, eyes wide with alarm. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Smitty whispered urgently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake turned back to where the figure had been, but it was gone. The jungle was once again still and silent, the shadows hiding whatever had just happened. Had it been real? Or was it just another trick of the mind, born out of exhaustion and fear? I don't know," Jake stammered, his voice shaky. "There was something here. I saw. Keep it together, man," Smitty said, glancing around nervously. "We're all on edge, but we can't afford to lose it out here. Whatever it was, it's gone now." Jake nodded, trying to steady his breathing. But the fear lingered, gnawing at him like a dark presence that refused to leave. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something in the jungle was stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence, the men too afraid to speak of what they were feeling. When morning finally came, the sun offered little comfort. The jungle was still thick with mist, the air heavy and oppressive. The men packed up their gear quickly, eager to leave the cursed spot behind. As they prepared to move out, Jake couldn't help but glance back at the spot where the ghostly soldier had stood. The jungle looked the same as it always had, but he knew better now. There were things in this place that defied explanation, things that could drive a man to madness if he wasn't careful. "Let's get moving," Davis ordered, his voice tight with tension. "We need to reach the top before nightfall." The platoon moved out, but the unease lingered. Every step felt like it was leading them deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. And as they climbed higher up the hill, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. Jake could feel at the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching them from the depths of the forest. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, filling his mind with dread. He tried to push them away, to focus on the mission, but the fear was too strong. They were walking into a trap, he realized, and whatever was waiting for them at the top of the hill wasn't going to let them leave alive. May 13, 1969, midday. The platoon advanced slowly up the hill, the dense jungle closing in around them like a living entity. The air was thick with humidity, and every breath felt labored. The sun, high in the sky, did little to penetrate the heavy canopy, leaving the path ahead shrouded in a perpetual gloom. Sergeant Davis kept his men moving, his eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of enemy movement. But the deeper they went, the more it felt like the hill itself was the enemy. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sounds being the men's heavy footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Even the birds seemed to have fled, leaving the jungle eerily still. Jake's nerves were frayed. The events of the previous night had left him shaken, and the oppressive atmosphere of the jungle only heightened his anxiety. He kept replaying the encounter with the ghostly soldier in his mind, questioning his sanity. Was it a hallucination, or had he really seen the specter of a fallen enemy warning them to turn back? As they climbed higher, the whispers began. At first, Jake thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but soon the murmurs grew louder, more distinct. They were faint, disembodied voices carried on the breeze, impossible to pin down. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable pleas, warnings, and cries of anguish from souls long departed. "Do you hear that?" Smitty whispered, falling in step beside Jake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. "Yeah, I hear it." The two men exchanged a look, the unspoken understanding that they were not alone on this hill. The jungle was alive with the voices of the dead, and the spirits were not pleased with their presence. Up ahead, Davis paused, raising a hand to signal a halt. The men crouched down, scanning the area nervously, but there was nothing to see, only the endless stretch of jungle, twisted trees, and thick undergrowth. The whispers continued, growing more insistent, as if urging them to turn back. "Stay sharp," Davis muttered, though his own voice betrayed a hint of unease. "We're getting close to the top." The men pushed on, but the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder with each step. Jake could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, his senses screaming at him to run, to escape this cursed place. Then, without warning, the jungle erupted in gunfire. It happened so fast that Jake barely had time to react. One moment, they were trudging through the undergrowth, and the next, bullets were whizzing past them, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the trees. Davis shouted orders, and the men dove for cover, returning fire as they tried to get a fix on the enemy's position. But the attack was unlike anything they had encountered before. The gunfire seemed to come from all directions, yet there was no clear target. The enemy was invisible, hidden in the shadows, and every time they thought they had them pinned down, the firing would shift, as if the jungle itself was attacking them. Jake's hands were shaking as he fired blindly into the trees. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he forced himself to focus. He could see the other men crouch low, their faces tight with fear and confusion. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, and it was driving them to the brink of panic. Suddenly, the gunfire ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. The jungle was still again, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Ceasefire," Davis called out, his voice hoarse. "Ceasefire." The men slowly lowered their weapons, their eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no bodies, no sign of the enemy. Just the jungle, as impenetrable as ever. "What the hell was that?" Smitty muttered, his voice trembling. Jake shook his head, unable to find an answer. The whispers had returned, louder than before, and now they were accompanied by something else, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was like the hill itself was groaning, as if waking from a long slumber. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "This place, it's wrong. We're not supposed to be here." Davis looked around at his men, his expression grim. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. They were soldiers, trained to fight, but this was something beyond their understanding. They were up against forces that bullets couldn't stop, and it was taking its toll. But they couldn't turn back now. They were too deep in enemy territory, and their mission was to take the hill. Orders were orders, and they had no choice but to continue. "Keep moving," Davis ordered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Stay close and keep your eyes open. We're almost there." The platoon moved forward, but the fear was palpable. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker, the whispers louder. Every step felt like a descent into madness, as if the hill itself was trying to swallow them whole. As they neared the summit, the air grew colder, and a thick mist began to rise from the ground, obscuring their vision. The whispers were now a constant, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining, filling their minds with dread. The men's nerves were frayed, their fear palpable, but they pushed on, driven by a mix of duty and desperation. And then they saw at the top of the hill, just beyond a clearing up ahead. But instead of relief, the sight filled them with a sense of impending doom. The mist was thickening, swirling around them like a living entity, and within it, they could see shapes vague, ghostly figures moving through the fog. "Get ready," Davis whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers. "We're not alone." The men tightened their grips on their weapons, their eyes wide with terror. They could feel at the presence of something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world, and it was waiting for them at the top of the hill. As they stepped into the clearing, the mist parted, revealing the summit of Hill 937. The air was deathly cold, and the ground was littered with the remnants of past battles, rusted helmets, shattered weapons, and bones, bleached white by the elements. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Standing in the center of the clearing was a lone figure, dressed in the tattered remains of a soldier's uniform. His back was to them, but there was something unmistakably wrong about him. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as if he was only half there, caught between this world and the next. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the figure began to turn. Jake's heart raced as the figure slowly faced them, revealing a face twisted in anguish, as empty and soulless. It was a face he recognized, a face that had haunted his dreams since the day he died. "Harris," Jake whispered, his voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. It only stared at them with those hollow, lifeless eyes, as if judging them, condemning them for their presence on this cursed hill. And then, without warning, it began to scream. The sound was inhuman, a wail of pure agony that echoed through the jungle, reverberating off the trees and shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The men clutched their ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The scream pierced through them, filling their minds with a terror unlike anything they had ever felt. Jake fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the world around him seemed to spin. He could feel his sanity slipping away, consumed by the scream and the darkness that was closing in on him. But through the chaos, he heard Davis's voice, shouting orders, trying to rally the men. It was a lifeline, something to hold onto in the madness. "Fall back," Davis yelled. "Fall back now." The men scrambled to their feet, their fear driving them into a frenzied retreat. They didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, fleeing down the hill as fast as their legs could carry them, desperate to escape the nightmare that had overtaken them. But the scream followed them, echoing in their minds, growing louder and more unbearable with every step. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows twisting and writhing, as if alive, as if trying to drag them back. Jake could barely see through the tears in his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The world was a blur of darkness and sound, a cacophony of terror that threatened to consume him. But he kept running, driven by a single, overwhelming instinct: survival. May 13, 1969, afternoon. The platoon stumbled down the hill in a disoriented frenzy, each man driven by the primal urge to escape the horrors they had just encountered. The jungle was a blur around them, the once familiar terrain now twisted and alien. The oppressive mist clung to them, obscuring their vision, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Jake could barely catch his breath as he pushed forward, his mind reeling from the encounter with the ghostly figure. Harris's face, twisted in agony, was burned into his memory, a haunting reminder of the unnatural forces at play on this cursed hill. The inhuman scream still echoed in his ears, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "Keep moving," Davis barked, his voice strained with fear and exhaustion. He led the way, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of safety. But there was none, only the endless, suffocating jungle that seemed to close in around them with every step. The men followed Davis blindly, their terror overriding any sense of strategy or discipline. They were soldiers, trained to face the horrors of war, but this was something else entirely, something beyond their comprehension. The whispers had returned, growing louder and more insistent, mingling with the sound of the ghostly wail that still seemed to echo through the trees. "We need to find a place to regroup," Davis shouted over the noise. "We can't keep running like this." But the jungle offered no refuge. The further they descended, the more the terrain seemed to shift and change, as if the hill itself was alive and intent on trapping them. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the jungle for any sign of a safe place to stop. But there was nothing. The only thing that awaited them in this dark, twisted forest was more terror. His thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion, and he could feel his grip on reality slipping. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, the whispers grew more distinct, as if the spirits were drawing closer. They were no longer just disembodied voices now. The men could see shapes moving in the mist, ghostly figures that flitted through the trees, watching them with cold, empty eyes. "Stay together," Davis called out, his voice tinged with desperation. "Don't let them separate us." But it was too late. The mist was thickening, swirling around them like a living entity, and the men were beginning to lose sight of each other. Jake could feel the panic rising in his chest as he struggled to keep up with the others. But the jungle seemed to conspire against him, throwing obstacles in his path and pulling him off course. "Jake," Smitty's voice called out from somewhere behind him, but it was muffled, distant, as if coming from another world. "Smitty," Jake shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the jungle, lost in the cacophony of whispers and wails. Panic set in as Jake realized he was alone, separated from the others by the dense fog and twisted trees. His heart raced, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he spun around, trying to find his bearings. But the jungle was disorienting. Every direction looked the same, and the mist obscured any landmarks that could guide him back to the group. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as the whispers grew louder, pressing in on him from all sides. The ghostly figures in the mist seemed to draw closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths moving in silent pleas. "Get a grip, Jake," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. "You can't lose it now. You have to find the others." But even as he tried to calm himself, the jungle around him seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. The mist thickened, curling around him like tendrils, and the ground beneath his feet felt soft and unstable, as if he were walking on a layer of corpses. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized that the ground was indeed covered in something bones. Human bones, scattered across the jungle floor, half buried in the dirt and tangled in the roots of the trees. He recoiled in horror, his mind reeling at the sight. But there was no time to process the grisly discovery. The whispers had become deafening, and the ghostly figures in the mist were closing in, their faces twisted in expressions of torment. Jake could feel their cold presence, their anger and pain. and he knew that they were not going to let him leave this hill alive. A scream tore from Jake's throat as he bolted forward, running blindly through the jungle. The branches clawed at him, tearing his uniform and leaving bloody scratches on his skin, but he didn't care. All he could think about was escaping the nightmarish entities that pursued him. But no matter how fast he ran, the mist seemed to follow, thickening around him until he could barely see a few feet ahead. The ghostly figures moved with him, their whispers now a cacophony of despair and rage, driving him deeper into the jungle. Jake's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he pushed on, driven by sheer terror. He didn't know how long he had been running, but it felt like an eternity. The jungle was an endless maze, and the fear that he would never escape this place gnawed at his mind. Suddenly, Jake's foot caught on something, and he went down hard, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his leg, and he cried out, clutching at his ankle. It was twisted, maybe broken, but there was no time to worry about that. The whispers were all around him now, the ghostly figures closing in, their hands reaching out to claim him. Jake scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming from the pain and fear. He could barely stand, let alone run, but he forced himself to move, limping forward as fast as he could. The mist was so thick now that he could barely see his own hands, and the jungle around him seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. As he stumbled forward, Jake could feel the ground beneath him shifting, as if the very earth was trying to swallow him whole. He was losing his grip on reality, his mind unraveling under the relentless assault of fear and pain. But then, through the fog, Jake saw a faint light, a flicker of hope in the darkness. It was dim, barely visible, but it was there, shining through the mist like a beacon. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jake limped toward the light, his heart pounding with a mix of desperation and hope. He didn't know what it was, but it was the only thing keeping him from succumbing to the terror that threatened to consume him. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, cutting through the mist and revealing a small clearing up ahead. Jake could see the silhouettes of figures standing in the clearing, and his heart leapt with relief. He wasn't alone, he had found the others. But as Jake stumbled into the clearing, the relief turned to dread. The figures were not his comrades, but the same ghostly apparitions that had been haunting him. They stood in a circle, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and anger. In the center of the circle was the source of the light, a small, flickering flame that hovered in the air, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The flame seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing brighter as Jake approached. The ghostly figures parted as Jake stumbled forward, his eyes locked on the flame. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that this was the heart of the hill's darkness, the source of the terror that had gripped him and his men. The flame flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the clearing. As Jake reached out toward it, he felt a surge of energy, a connection to something ancient and powerful, something that had been buried in the hill for centuries. The ghostly figures watched in silence as Jake's hand hovered over the flame, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Jake could feel their presence, their pain and suffering, and he knew that they were the souls of the men who had died on this hill, their spirits trapped here for eternity. With a trembling hand, Jake reached out and touched the flame. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him exploded in a blinding flash of light. The blinding light consumed Jake, and for a moment, he felt as though he was floating in a void, weightless and disconnected from reality. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and Jake found himself standing in the same clearing. But everything had changed. The mist was gone, and the jungle around him was eerily still. The ghostly figures had vanished, and the flickering flame that had once hovered in the center of the clearing was now a roaring fire, its flames crackling and spitting as they licked the air. Jake blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His body felt strangely light, as if the fear and exhaustion that had weighed him down moments before had been lifted. But his mind was still reeling, trying to grasp the significance of the strange vision he had just experienced. He looked around the clearing, half expecting the ghostly apparitions to return, But there was nothing, only the fire, which now seemed to burn with a fierce intensity, its flames casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. "Jake," a voice called out, cutting through the silence. Jake turned to see Davis and Smitty emerging from the trees, their faces etched with worrying and relief. They were disheveled, covered in dirt and sweat, but they were alive, and more importantly, they were real. "Davis, Smitty," Jake shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "You're okay. We could say the same about you," Davis said, his voice strained as he hurried to Jake's side. "We thought we lost you back there. What the hell happened?" "I don't know," Jake stammered, his mind still struggling to process everything that had transpired. "There was this light, and then ... I saw them, the ghosts. I think they're the spirits of the men who died here. They're trapped, Davis, they're trapped on this hill." Davis exchanged a wary glance with Smitty, who nodded solemnly. "We saw them too," Smitty said quietly. "But it wasn't just ghosts, Jake. There's something darker here, something evil." Jake's gaze shifted to the fire, its flames now burning with an unnatural intensity. He could feel its heat from where he stood, but there was something else, a sense of malevolent energy that radiated from the flames, as if the fire was alive, feeding on the fear and suffering of the spirits trapped on the hill. "We have to end this," Davis said, his voice firm despite the fear that lingered in his eyes. "Whatever this thing is, we can't leave it here. It won't just stay on this hill, it'll spread, like a disease. We have to destroy it, but how?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "We don't even know what it is." Jake hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. The thought of destroying it filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if some part of him knew that it was a dangerous and foolish plan. But he also knew that they had no other choice. They couldn't leave this place until the evil was purged, no matter the cost. "Okay," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Let's do it." The three men quickly gathered what explosives they had left, several grenades and a small block of C4 that Davis had been carrying in his pack. They worked in tense silence, their movements hurried and purposeful, knowing that every second counted. As they set the charges around the fire, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air was thick with tension, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on them, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel the presence of the spirits, their fear and anger palpable, as if they were begging him to stop. "We're ready," Davis said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He held up the detonator, his finger hovering over the button. "On my mark." Jake and Smitty nodded, their faces set with determination. 3, 2, 1. Davis pressed the button, and the world around them erupted in a deafening explosion. The ground shook violently as the charges detonated, sending flames and debris soaring into the air. The fire roared with an almost inhuman fury, as if fighting against its own destruction, but the explosives had done their job. Within seconds, the fire began to falter, its flames shrinking and sputtering as the force of the explosion snuffed out its life. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath as the last of the flames died out, leaving only a smoking crater where the fire had once been. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the hill was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and relief. The jungle was still, the air cool and refreshing, and the haunting whispers that had tormented them were finally silenced. "We did it," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. He could hardly believe it. They had survived. They had destroyed the evil that had plagued the hill, and the spirits of the dead were finally at peace. Davis and Smitty exchanged a look of exhausted relief before turning back to Jake. "Let's get the hell out of here," Davis said, his voice heavy with weariness. "We've done what we came here to do." The three men made their way down the hill, the jungle now eerily quiet around them. As they descended, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The memories of the horrors they had faced on the hill would stay with him forever, but he knew that they had done the right thing. They had ended the curse, and the spirits could finally rest. As they reached the base of the hill, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. For the first time since they had arrived, the jungle felt peaceful, as if the land itself was finally free from the grip of the darkness that had haunted it for so long. "We're going home," Smitty said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "We made it." Jake nodded, a faint smile on his lips as they continued their journey back to camp. The horrors of Hill 937 would never be forgotten, but they had survived, and that was enough. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.